They say you don't inherit a house. You inherit everything it tried to bury. When I stepped into Westgrove Estate, I wasn't walking into property. I was walking into a story nobody wanted to finish. A house with no ghosts, only the long, suffocating echo of family silence. And when Will warned me not to step outside my room at midnight, I thought it was superstition. I was wrong. What I found was far worse than the supernatural. I found the truth, and it remembered me that I hadn't spoken to anyone from my father's side of the family in over 20 years when the letter came. Thick cream-colored parchment folded inside a black envelope, my name etched in raised cursive like an echo from a century ago. It arrived on a Tuesday mid-morning, damp outside, and I nearly mistook it for one of the debt collection notices I'd come to dread. It had been a rough year. After losing my job, my partner, and nearly my apartment, I'd found myself clawing through days on autopilot, scrubbing tables at a diner by night, and sleeping through the shame by day. When I tore the envelope open, my hands were still raw from bleach. I read the letter 3 times, not because I couldn't believe it, but because I didn't want to. It was from a solicitor in Norfolk, informing me that I had been named sole heir to the Westgrove Estate, a property I barely remembered except for a single photo my father once burned in front of me after a phone call that ended in fists and silence. The solicitor's tone was painfully polite, yet clipped like he was trying not to say too much. There is, however, it read, one stipulation in the will which requires your acknowledgement. You must not, under any circumstances, remain outside your room past midnight within the grounds of Westgrove. I blinked, then laughed, and then cried, because the absurdity of it cracked something inside me. I was broke, alone, and grasping at anything that offered a shred of change, even a crumbling estate attached to a warning straight out of a Gothic novel. But it wasn't the warning that made me cry. It was a signature, Leonard A. Caro, my uncle, my father's estranged brother, a name never spoken without venom in our household. I barely remember the man, only a handful of images from childhood summers, the bitter smell of whiskey on his coat, a stubborn tick in his left eye, and the sound of his voice like gravel under tires. After my mother died, my father closed the door on the entire Caro family, and I had followed suit more out of obedience than understanding. But now the past had wormed its way back to the surface. I sat with that letter for hours, rereading it until the ink blurred. In the quiet of my one-room flat, memories I'd tried to bury surfaced with sickening ease. My father's rages, his refusal to ever explain why we left Norfolk in the dead of night when I was 8, the way he drank after certain dates on the calendar, and the fact that he never let me keep that one photograph of a house I now suspected was Westgrove. My father had died 5 years ago, alone and bitter, taking whatever secrets he carried with him. And now his brother had died too, leaving me in a state I had never seen, with a warning he somehow knew would be read long after his voice was silenced. I called the solicitor the next day, my voice trembling as I introduced myself. He sounded relieved to hear from me, as if he'd expected I might not respond. He told me the property had been uninhabited for almost a decade, save for brief visits from caretakers who never stayed long. The will had been written over 6 years ago, but updated recently, just months before my uncle's death. And yes, the stipulation about midnight was legally binding, though more symbolic than enforceable. It's an old man's request, the solicitor said softly. Eccentric, perhaps, but he was adamant. I asked about the condition of the house. He hesitated. Structurally sound, but you'll find it emotionally dense. That phrase struck me, emotionally dense, as if a place could retain sorrow the way lungs retain smoke. That night, I lay awake for hours, imagining the house, tall, shadowed, waiting. I wasn't scared. I was empty, and sometimes emptiness is more dangerous than fear. When you have nothing, even cursed legacies feel like salvation. I left for Norfolk that weekend with a single suitcase, and the letter folded into my coat pocket. Like a passport to a life I didn't yet believe would be mine. I told no one. There was no one to tell. On the train ride north, I watched the landscape grow colder, grayer, like it was preparing me for what was to come. As the train curved through valleys and under pale bridges, I felt a strange pull, like the house was remembering me, calling me back to something I never truly understood. And when I stepped off the platform in that forgotten town, one I hadn't seen since I was a child, I swear the wind whispered my name, not with welcome, but with warning. I didn't flinch. I was too far gone to turn back, too desperate to question fate. And above all, I needed to know why they would warn me about midnight. The taxi that picked me up from the station was old, the kind that rattles when it idles and smells like damp wool and engine grease, and the driver, a man in his 70s with a voice like torn sandpaper, didn't ask questions when I handed him the crumpled note with the estate's address written in block letters. Just gave me a sideways look like he recognized it, like he was too old to pretend that name didn't carry weight, and said, "You sure?" with a half smile that wasn't kind. I nodded. The ride was longer than I remembered. But I wasn't sure if that was because of the winding roads or the weight in my chest, the memories clawing their way up like weeds through cracks in concrete. The town faded behind us quickly, swallowed by fog and forest, and with every passing mile, the trees seemed to lean in closer, gnarled limbs arching overhead like the estate was being hidden from the rest of the world by nature itself, protected or imprisoned. I didn't speak for most of the ride, just watched as familiar shapes returned to my mind. A crooked signpost I remembered asking about when I was 6, a stone bridge I had once thrown a paper boat from before my father grabbed my arm and yanked me back without a word. That kind of memory doesn't come clean. It drips with the mud of forgotten pain. The driver finally slowed as we approached a rusted gate that stood half open, a sign hanging by one hinge that read, Westgrove. Private property, in paint so faded it looked like dried blood. The house itself wasn't visible yet, just hints of it through the overgrown hedges and mist. A spire here, a window there, like a corpse only half exhumed. I stepped out onto gravel and immediately felt the air change, heavier, still, like it had been holding its breath for years. The driver didn't get out. He just gave me a nod and said, "Wouldn't stay past sundown," like it was advice worn down to reflex. Then he drove off, leaving me with my suitcase and the estate looming behind the trees like a secret trying not to be remembered. I followed the path up toward the main house, every step sinking a little deeper into gravel softened by moss and time. The trees finally parted to reveal Westgrove Estate in full. Tall gray stone, weather-beaten but not ruined. Its windows darkened by grime and shadow, its roof line sharp against the cloudy sky like the teeth of something ancient and patient. It didn't look haunted in the traditional sense. It looked tired, like it had been waiting for someone to come back and listen. The front door groaned when I pushed it open, not dramatically, not like in the movies, but in a way that felt personal, like it was letting me in because it remembered me. Inside, the air was cold and dry, and the smell was like old wood, mildew, and the faintest hint of something floral, like perfume long since absorbed into wallpaper. The foyer was wide, the kind that used to impress guests, but now just echoed with absence. A staircase curved upward, its banister worn smooth by hands that had long since disappeared. I left my suitcase by the door and stepped further in, my boots clicking softly on wood that creaked under my weight like I hadn't held anyone in years. Dust blanketed everything, muting colors, softening edges, like the house had tried to bury its own memories. I moved through room after room, parlor, study, dining hall, each more oppressive than the last, not because of what they contained, but because of what they didn't. No signs of life, no warmth, just furniture draped in sheets like corpses under linen, portraits on the walls with faces scratched or faded, and that ever-present silence that wasn't empty but watchful. I found a kitchen eventually, and though it had clearly not been used in years, it bore signs of life, recent life. A cracked mug on the counter, an empty wine bottle in the sink, a chair pulled slightly out from the table. Someone had been here, not long ago, maybe the caretaker the solicitor mentioned, or maybe someone else. I didn't want to speculate. Not yet. Upstairs, I found the bedroom that had been prepared for me. It was the only one without a sheet over the bed, the only one with a light bulb that worked when I flicked the switch. There was a note on the nightstand, typed in crisp font on Westgrove letterhead, and signed, "You are welcome here. Midnight is not a time. It is a memory. Do not forget that." My throat tightened. I put the note down and sat on the bed, which creaked but held. I should have left then. Should have taken that note as the warning it was. But something kept me anchored, not curiosity, not greed. something deeper, something like grief. I wandered the halls for hours after that, exploring the house with a kind of reverence I didn't understand, touching the frames of paintings that seemed to watch me back, pausing by bookshelves filled with volumes that hadn't been opened since the Cold War. I found a piano in one of the drawing rooms, its keys yellowed and cracked, and without knowing why, I pressed one, middle C, and the sound that came out was broken, like a cry smothered by distance. That night, I didn't sleep well. The house creaked and settled, but it wasn't the noises that kept me awake. It was a feeling that I wasn't alone. Not that someone was watching me. Worse, that someone was waiting. I kept the door closed as instructed, and lay in the dark listening to the tick of an old grandfather clock somewhere in the hall, counting seconds like heartbeats. At midnight, it chimed 12 times, and with each strike, I felt the weight of that warning settle deeper into my bones. I heard no footsteps, no whispers, no supernatural terrors. Just the house breathing, and me trying not to breathe too loudly in return. Morning came gray and slow, light creeping in through windows like a guilty confession. I rose, made coffee on an ancient stovetop with instant packets I found in a drawer, and stared out the window at the overgrown garden where something moved. Just a bird, maybe, or the wind. But for a moment, I could have sworn I saw a figure. Tall, still, gone in a blink. I turned away and told myself it was nothing. But the truth settled heavy in my chest. Westgrove was not abandoned. It had been waiting. And I was beginning to suspect that what it remembered wasn't just my uncle or my father, or whatever history they tried to bury. It remembered me, and it had something to say. The lawyer arrived 2 days later, in a dark green sedan that looked painfully out of place against the wild grass and encroaching ivy that had begun to swallow the estate's once pristine drive. And when he stepped out, briefcase in hand, trench coat collar high against the wind, I was struck not by his appearance, but by his hesitance. He stood at the gate for a long moment before opening it, as if the simple act of crossing onto the property demanded a certain courage he hadn't yet decided he possessed. It wasn't until I called out from the porch that he finally moved, his polished shoes crunching the gravel with deliberate steps, each one sounding like a verdict. He introduced himself as Mr. Travers, voice clipped and cautious, the kind of man who had spent his life reading the fine print and had learned the hard way never to ask questions he wasn't prepared to hear answered. Inside, I led him to the study, one of the few rooms I had begun to reclaim from the dust and the quiet. And as he set his briefcase down on the old desk, I watched his eyes dart to the corners of the ceiling, the cracks in the wallpaper, the long-dead fireplace, as if mapping an exit strategy in case the walls began to speak. He didn't sit until I did. Then he opened the briefcase with practiced precision, pulling out a set of documents bound in a red leather folio, and began with the basics: my identity, the legitimacy of the will, the legal transfer of the estate to my name. But he was fidgeting, fingers tapping the folio's edge, and I could feel it building. The moment he would shift from procedural into the personal, the moment the room would change. And then he cleared his throat and said, "There is one clause in particular that Mr. Carroll insisted be read aloud, in person, without exception." He removed a single page from the back of the folio and unfolded it with almost theatrical care. His eyes met mine once, briefly, as if to warn me, and then he began to read, voice steady but strange, like he was reciting something sacred or cursed. "To my heir, I offer this house, Westgrove, with full rights and responsibilities thereof. However, let it be understood that the estate carries with a condition. From the day of inheritance, and for the duration of any occupancy, the heir must not, under any circumstances, remain outside their bedroom past the hour of midnight. This is not superstition. This is survival. I will not explain further. You must trust that the truth is not yours to seek after dark." He folded the letter again and laid it between us like a loaded gun. I didn't speak. I couldn't, because something in the way he read it, something in the phrasing, felt not like a warning passed down through legalese, but like a confession pulled from the edge of sanity. I wanted to laugh, to say what kind of madman leaves behind a bedtime curfew in his last testament, but the look on Travers' face stopped me. He wasn't amused. He was afraid. "Did he ever explain it to you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Travers shook his head, only that it was non-negotiable. He made me swear I would deliver that clause exactly as written. he said, and here he faltered, eyes drifting to window. He said, the house remembers, and that remembering is the most dangerous thing it can do. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, not from any phantom presence, but from the sheer weight of those words. The house remembers. What did that mean? Memories couldn't hurt you. But this house, it felt like memory incarnate, a place soaked in history, so thick it clung to your skin, crawled into your thoughts. Travers finished his explanation with the efficiency of someone eager to leave. The keys were officially mine, as was everything within the estate. Furniture, documents, debts, and all. There was no one else named in the will. No other heirs. Just me. I signed the papers, my hand shaking more than I expected. And when it was done, Travers closed the folio with a soft snap, stood, and said, I would advise you, off the record, to take the warning seriously. Your uncle was a difficult man, but he wasn't a fool. Then he left, quicker than he arrived, and I watched from the window as his car disappeared down the drive, leaving me alone with the ink still drying on my inheritance and a clause I didn't know how to live with. That night, I walked the halls as the sun went down, touching the walls like they might offer answers if I pressed hard enough. I found myself drawn to a particular corridor on the second floor, one I hadn't noticed before, a narrow passage lined with family portraits, each more faded than the last, faces blurred by time and neglect. At the end of the hall was a door, locked, its keyhole rusted shut, and I stood there for a long time wondering what lay behind it, why my uncle had gone to such lengths to make me fear the dark. I returned to my room before midnight, heart heavy with questions, and listened as the old clock downstairs began to chime. 12 slow, resonant tolls. Nothing happened. No footsteps. No creaking doors. Just silence. But it wasn't a safe silence. It was the kind that listens back. The next morning, I began searching the house more thoroughly, not for ghosts, but for answers. I found a journal in the library, its spine cracked, its pages filled with my uncle's slanted handwriting. The entries were fragmented, sometimes incoherent, but a theme emerged: regret, secrecy, fear. He wrote often to my father, of things left unsaid, of mistakes that could not be undone. And then one line, buried on a page near the end, written in all caps: the door at midnight is a door in time. Memory bleeds. Close it. I stared at that line for hours. The words seared into my mind. A door in time. It made no sense. And yet it explained everything. This wasn't about ghosts or monsters. It was about memory, about something in this house, something in this family, that had been buried so deep it had started to rot, to seep into walls, into the very hours of the night. I didn't know what I was looking for anymore, but I knew I had to keep looking, because the house wasn't just remembering. It was remembering me. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm, one I didn't recognize but couldn't break, a rhythm dictated not by time or weather, but by the house itself, its silences louder than speech, its corners deeper than they looked. And as I moved from room to room trying to reclaim some sense of order or purpose, I found myself slipping, not into madness, but into something far more subtle. Memory, that slow, suffocating tide that pulls you under before you realize you've been drowning in it for years. And though I tried to busy myself, scrubbing counters, replacing bulbs, even dragging old sheets from furniture to let sunlight in, it all felt performative, like tidying a mausoleum for ghosts that didn't need the courtesy. And with every passing afternoon, I felt my resolve wearing thin, like wallpaper peeling from damp stone, until even the sound of my own footsteps in the long corridors began to feel intrusive, like I was trespassing in a life that was opposed, to be mine but never quite fit. The estate was vast, larger than I remembered, and each hallway seemed to bend subtly when I walked alone, like it was stretching or shrinking to match the pressure in my chest, and every room I entered was heavy with the residue of lives half-lived. A chair pushed back as if someone had just stood, a scuff mark on the floor shaped like a child's boot, drawers that stuck only after you'd already committed to opening them, revealing yellowed letters half-torn, notes unsigned, dates missing. I try not to read too deeply, try not to assign meaning to every creak or draft or rustle in the hedgerow just beyond the cracked windows, but there was no ignoring the feeling that grew stronger each night, the sensation that the house was aware of me, not in the way a haunted house might loom, but in the way a grieving person does, silent, waiting, holding back just enough not to collapse in front of you. I began sleeping with the door locked, not out of fear, but to mark a boundary, to honor the clause in the will, even though nothing had happened yet. And each night, I sat in the center of my bed and stared at the door like it might betray me or protect me or both. And as midnight approached, I could feel it, something imperceptible shifting in the air, like the house inhaled and held it, waiting to exhale until the 12th chime faded. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything I saw and heard, even if it was nothing but dust settling in the beams of morning light or the same crow landing on the balustrade outside the library window. I wrote about my dreams too, though I wasn't sure they were dreams. Images of staircases that led nowhere, of a woman humming behind a locked door, of voices arguing just beneath the floorboards. There was one recurring figure, always in shadow, standing in the garden with his back to me, unmoving, featureless, and even though I knew it was a trick of the mind, I couldn't help but glance out that window every morning just to be sure. On the 6th day, I found a room I hadn't seen before, tucked behind the west parlor, a narrow entryway disguised by a bookshelf that wasn't fixed to the wall, and inside was conservatory, its glass ceiling cracked and spotted with moss, the air inside thick with the scent of damp earth and forgotten growth. Dozens of plants had once thrived there, but now only a few struggled against the decay. A dying orchid, brittle vines curled around rusted trellises, a single cactus still upright in defiance of its surroundings. In the corner, covered by a linen tarp, was a rocking chair. I pulled it back and found a child's blanket folded over the armrest, the fabric faded but clean. Someone had been tending this place, if only occasionally. I sat in the chair and let it rock gently, back and forth, until I could almost hear the soft footsteps of a child running past, the whisper of a lullaby on the air, and for the first time in days I cried, not from fear, but from a grief I couldn't name, a loss I hadn't earned but felt all the same. That night, I found a photograph in the library tucked into a book of poetry by Christina Rossetti, 3 children sitting on the front steps of the house, all smiling, but none looking directly at the camera. I recognized my father instantly, young, his hair neat, his smile forced. Beside him was a girl I didn't know, and in the center, unmistakable in posture and jawline, was my Uncle Leonard, staring straight into the lens with a look I couldn't quite decipher, somewhere between defiance and desperation. On the back of the photo, written in a tight hand, was a single word, before. I spent the rest of the evening staring at that photo, turning it over and over like it might offer more if I just looked long enough. But it never changed. None of this did. The house was a monument to unfinished stories, and I was beginning to suspect mine had started here long before I was born. I began avoiding mirrors, not because I feared what I might see, but because I feared seeing myself too clearly, seeing the toll the house was taking, how it was drawing me inward, away from the outside world, erasing the sharp edges of my memory and replacing them with fog. I stopped checking my phone. There was no service anyway, and the outside world felt increasingly irrelevant. I started talking out loud, to myself, to the walls, to the figures in the photographs. "What happened to you?" I asked one night, staring at a portrait of a woman in a green dress who bore a striking resemblance to the girl in the photograph. No answer, of course, but the silence that followed was heavy, like the house disapproved of the question, or maybe more in the fact that I had to ask. I was beginning to understand what Travers meant when he said the house was emotionally dense. It didn't haunt, it absorbed. It remembered in a way that was almost too human, and it demanded that you remember too, whether you wanted to or not. And the worst part? I didn't want to leave, not because I felt safe or welcome, but because I felt compelled, like I owed it something. Like I was the final chapter in a story no one else had dared to finish. And I knew, deep down, that the answers I needed weren't going to be found in daylight or documents. They were going to come at midnight. And I was running out of reasons to stay in my room. IT was on the 8th night that the house finally answered me, not with words or warnings, but with something so tangible, so grounded in the real, it unraveled everything I clung to as rationality. Because until that moment I had managed to convince myself that the silence, the shadows, the suffocating presence of memory within these walls was psychological, an echo chamber for unresolved trauma, grief displaced on architecture. But that night, As the final toll of midnight's chime faded into the floorboards beneath my feet, I heard a sound that could not be mistaken. The unmistakable clatter of a latch being drawn, sharp and metallic, followed by the groaning resistance of a heavy door swinging open somewhere deep in the west wing, a part of the house I had not dared explore past sundown. And what struck me wasn't just the sound itself, but the deliberate nature of it, the unmistakable weight of intent. And for several minutes, I sat frozen on the edge of my bed, the blankets bunched in my fists, my breath held hostage by the sudden realization that I was no longer alone in the house in any symbolic or emotional sense. Someone had opened that door, someone whose presence defied all prior logic I'd applied to Westgrove's decay and mourning. Against every instinct in the explicit terms of the will, I stood and crept toward the hallway, my bare feet silent against the old wood, my hand trembling as it reached for the doorknob, not to open it, but simply to reassure myself that it was still locked from within. But the sound had been real. It hadn't come from my wing. It had come from a corridor past the library, behind a wall I'd assumed was decorative until now. Heart racing, I pressed my ear to the cool paneling and heard something faint, shuffling, then a pause, then the click of what sounded like a light switch, followed by a voice. Low, indistinct, male. I couldn't make out the words, but it wasn't a voice in my head. It had a direction, a weight, a vibration that belonged to something undeniably human. I backed away and returned to my room, bolting the door behind me, unsure whether to feel terrified or relieved, because as strange as it sounds, something in me had been waiting for this moment, the moment when the house would stop testing me with metaphor and start offering truth. The next morning, I searched for the source of the sound, tracing the floor plan as best I could from memory and old documents I'd found in the study. What I uncovered disturbed me more than the noise itself. A passage listed simply as the servants' gallery, sealed off in the 1960s after a fire damaged part of the western hallway, left unrepaired due to disuse. I found the entry point, hidden behind a bookshelf that swung out with a soft groan once I pressed a panel carved with a faded crest. Behind it, a narrow staircase descended into darkness, and at the bottom, I found a corridor that had clearly been traveled recently. Dust displaced, footprints not my own, and the distinct, acrid scent of old cigar smoke clinging to the air like a memory that hadn't fully left. I didn't go farther that day. Instead, I began to piece together a new theory, one I hated myself for even considering. What if the warning in the will wasn't about the supernatural? What if it was about a person, someone my uncle knew, someone he feared, someone who was still here? That night, I stayed awake, sitting by the door with a flashlight and a kitchen knife, feeling ridiculous but alert. Midnight came. The chimes began. And on the 12th, like a cue delivered in perfect time, I heard it again, the door opening, slower this time, and then silence, until a voice, clear now, called out not my name, but a name that stopped my heart cold. Charles. My father's name. I waited, breath caught like a thread, and then the voice called again, soft and mournful. Charles, it's late. I didn't move. I couldn't, because whatever was happening in that hallway, whoever was moving through that sealed gallery, knew my father, and believed, somehow, that he was still here. I thought of the journals my uncle had kept, of the lines that hinted at things buried too deep to name, of the photograph marked before, and a new kind of dread took root in me, not the fear of being haunted, but of being mistaken for someone else in a house that didn't forget. The next morning, I returned to the gallery and followed the passage farther than before, heart hammering with every step. It opened into a small parlor I hadn't known existed, furnished, barely dusty, as if someone had been using it all along. There was a fireplace, cold but clean, a record player with a warped disc still resting on its arm, and a photograph on the mantelpiece that stole the breath from my lungs. It was my father, but not young, older, gaunt, and beside him was a man I didn't recognize but who bore a striking resemblance to me, or what I imagined I might look like in 10 years. The resemblance was chilling. Beneath the photograph, scrawled into the wood of the mantel in a child's hand, were the words, "We wake at midnight." I stumbled backward, knocking into a side table, sending a dusty lamp crashing to the floor, and in the silence that followed, I realized something horrifying. Someone had been living here, perhaps for years, hiding within the house's forgotten corners, moving only at night, preserving not the history of the estate, but version of it. A version where my father never left, where Westgrove never decayed, where time had refused to move forward. The twist wasn't supernatural. It was human and infinitely more terrifying. Because someone here had spent years crafting a life from memory and routine, and I had just stepped into a role they'd been waiting to fill. That night, I didn't wait for chimes. I opened the door and waited in the hallway, listening as the first toll rang out. And this time, when the voice came, it was closer. "Charles," it said, "you forgot your promise." I held my breath, every muscle screaming to run. But I didn't. I whispered, "I'm not Charles." And the reply, after a long, aching silence, was worse than anything I could have imagined. "Yes, you are." The next morning dawned with strange, blinding clarity. Not in the sky, still overcast, dull as ever, but within me, as if something had been unearthed during the night, a root system of rot pulled suddenly into the light. And as I stood at the window of my room watching the overgrown garden shift in the wind, the events of the previous night played over my mind like a scene rehearsed endlessly in some parallel version of my life, one where I wasn't myself, where I wore someone else's skin, answered to someone else's name, and carried a burden I had never agreed to shoulder. "Yes, you are." The voice hadn't been angry. It hadn't even been confused. It had been certain, like a child correcting an adult, with quiet insistence born from years of repetition. And that certainty unsettled me more than any scream or demand ever could. It wasn't just that I was mistaken for my father. It was that whoever or whatever had spoken believed a lie with absolute, terrifying conviction. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stepped into a space that didn't obey the rules of reality as I understood them. Not through magic or the supernatural, but through grief, through a deliberate, painstakingly constructed delusion maintained by someone whose entire world had been built on denial. And the more I explored, the more I realized how little I truly knew about my family. That morning, I returned to the study, not the formal one off the foyer, but a hidden room I discovered behind a false panel in the library, a cramped chamber filled with boxes labeled in faded ink. L. Caro, R. Caro, and most chillingly C. Caro. I opened them slowly, carefully, expecting old tax documents or letters, but what I found was far more damning. Pages and pages of type reports, psychiatric evaluations, transcripts of family meetings, and a series of correspondences marked confidential between my grandfather and a doctor at a now-defunct private facility in the north. My father, Charles Caro, had been institutionalized in his 20s, not for violence or schizophrenia, as family rumors had once hinted, but for severe dissociation and trauma-induced memory fragmentation. According to the reports, he would disappear for hours within the estate as a young man, sometimes speaking to people who weren't there, often answering to the name Leonard, and later, when confronted, he would claim not to remember those moments at all. The implications were devastating. Not only had my father been deeply unwell, but his illness had been entangled with the very walls of Westgrove, and my uncle Leonard had not fled the family, as I had once believed. He had remained, inherited the estate, and seemingly spent decades trying to contain whatever legacy had driven his brother mad. I kept reading, and the picture grew clearer, more horrified with every line. Leonard hadn't lived alone by choice. He had isolated himself to protect others, to protect me. Among the letters was one dated exactly 5 years before my uncle's death, written but never sent. It was addressed to me. "You were too young to remember." It began, "But I must believe you will one day return. This house, it lives off memory. Not in a spectral sense, but in the way all grief does, quietly, pervasively, endlessly. Your father was the first to be swallowed by it. I was the second. You must not be the third." My throat tightened as I read it again and again, trying to reconcile the cold, distant man I remember with this tortured, protective figure who had watched his brother unravel and then spent the rest of his life trying to seal the cracks before someone else fell through. There were photographs too, grainy, old Polaroids and newer, digital prints, some of me as a child, playing the garden with my father, our expressions blurred but unmistakably linked, and others of Leonard, watching from the window, never smiling, always watching. In one, dated just 2 years ago, I stood near the fountain, laughing at something unseen. Except I hadn't been to Westgrove in over 2 decades. I stared at the photo for hours, convinced it had to be a mistake. But deep down, I knew what it meant. Someone else had been here. Someone who looked like me. Or perhaps some version of me I'd left behind. The most damning evidence came not in a photograph or report, but in a recording, a cassette tape buried at the bottom of the C. Caro box. I found an old player in the conservatory and sat in the dust to listen. It began with silence, then a click, then my father's voice, unmistakable even after all these years. "They say the house remembers," he said, tone flat and measured. "But it's not the house. It's me. I remember. I remember things that didn't happen. I remember being someone else. Sometimes I wake up and the mirrors don't work right. I look into them and I see him. Leonard. Or maybe he sees me. Then, softer, he built this place with walls meant to contain memory, but memory bleeds. It always bleeds." I turned off the tape, hands trembling. The pieces were aligning now, not into a clean picture, but into something far more tragic. A family undone by memory, by the inability to forget, or perhaps by the desire to remember too much. The house wasn't haunted. It was saturated with pain, with unresolved identity, with repetition. The past replayed, not because it had to, but because no one had the courage to stop it. And now I was part of it. That night, I didn't lock my door. I sat at my desk and wrote, not in my journal, but on the back of the photograph I'd found in the secret parlor. "I am not Charles," I wrote. "I am not Leonard. I am what comes after." And then I waited. Midnight came like always. The chimes rang, and in the hallway, footsteps approached. Slow, steady, measured. I stood as the door creaked open, not by some unseen force, but by a hand, human and trembling. And there he was, the man from the photograph. Older, hollow-eyed, dressed in a worn sweater that once belonged to my father. "Charles," he said, voice catching, "you came back." I didn't speak. I couldn't, because I finally understood. This man, whoever he was, had been living here, trapped in a loop of belief so deep he no longer remembered where it began. He had mistaken me for my father, just as the house had mistaken me for a memory. "It's not safe after midnight," he said, backing into the hallway, gesturing for me to follow. "You said so yourself." And then he was gone, swallowed by the west wing. I didn't follow. Not yet, but I would, because the silence that had built this place wasn't just in its halls or portraits or fading letters. It was in us, in all of us. And if I didn't find its source, if I didn't bury it properly this time, it would continue. Another generation. Another life lost to Westgrove. Another name forgotten and replaced. He appeared first in the margins of my awareness, not as a shock or an apparition, but as an almost expected presence, like they never will return a long-lost verse in a song I had forgotten I knew, just beyond the hedgerow, near the dry fountain where moss had claimed the stone cherubs and ivy grew over cracked marble. A man stood, still and distant, facing the garden wall with his hands clasped behind his back, as if inspecting something only he could see. And at first, I thought he might be another memory, some echo projected by the house like so many of its emotional shadows. But the longer I stared, the clearer he became, real in the way breath fogs and cold air, his shape solid and defined even in the hazy afternoon light. And what unsettled me most wasn't his sudden presence, but the quiet familiarity in his posture. He stood like someone I knew, with a kind of inherited sadness in the shoulders, a restraint in the hands that mirrored the way. My father used to stand when listening to someone he didn't trust but had to endure, and I watched from behind the lace curtain for nearly an hour, too afraid to approach, too curious to look away, until finally he turned slowly and looked directly at the house. Not at me, but through me, as if he knew exactly where I stood, and in that moment I saw his face. And every breath I had taken that day left me in one great exhale of disbelief, because he looked like me, older, weathered, but unmistakably the same blood, the same bone, the same burdens etched into the same brow. And as he held my gaze across the garden, something passed between us, not a recognition exactly, but an acknowledgement, like he'd been waiting for me to see him, and now that I had, the next stage could begin. I ran out into the garden, slipping on wet stone, heart hammering. But by the time I reached the fountain, he was gone, and the only sound was the wind brushing to the tall grass, whispering a name I couldn't quite catch. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the bedroom floor with the family photo album spread around me, leafing through pages of brittle memories, trying to find him, to name him, to place his face somewhere in the disjointed lineage I'd inherited like a broken mirror. And just before dawn, I found it, a photograph I'd somehow missed before, tucked between pages of water-stained receipts. A boy, 10 or 11, standing beside my father, both of them in school uniforms, both looking directly at the camera, though only my father smiled. The boy was not labeled, no date or note, but the resemblance was undeniable. I had a brother, or perhaps my father did. Another Caro, another branch snapped off and hidden. The next morning, I returned to the garden, not hoping to find him, but needing to see where he had stood, and in the muddy soil beneath the hedgerow, I found footprints, deep, fresh, adult-sized, leading not toward the house but away, into the woods behind the estate, where the family boundaries blurred into forest. I followed them without thinking, the undergrowth clawing at my ankles, branches whipping across my face like forgotten hands try to hold me back, and after nearly an hour walking, I found a clearing I didn't know existed, circular, unnaturally symmetrical, with a stone bench at the center and scattered bits of wire and glass along the edges, remnants of something once enclosed but now open to the sky. And on the bench sat a book, a journal, leather-bound, the initials R.C. etched faintly on the cover. I opened it with shaking fingers and read the first line. I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, the house would forget me. The entries were erratic, fragmented, dated sporadically over the last 15 years, detailing days spent hidden in the West Wing, memories of childhood games gone wrong, a deep, unresolved hatred for Leonard Caro, and then, most disturbingly, a gradual descent into obsession with Charles, the man he believed had broken the family, the brother who disappeared and left him behind to carry the madness alone. As I read, it became clear that the man in the garden was not a stranger. He was Richard Caro, my father's younger brother, my uncle, erased from the records, institutionalized as a boy after a violent episode, and quietly released years later under Leonard's guardianship. But instead of recovery, Richard had been hidden, cloistered away within the estate like a shameful relic, allowed to roam forgotten corridors under the guise of protection, his reality allowed to twist and harden into something unrecognizable. And now, he had mistaken me for my father, not out of malice, but because in his world, the loop had never ended. The betrayal had never been resolved. The clock had never moved past midnight. I returned to the house with the journal pressed to my chest like a holy text, unsure of what to do, of how to confront a man who lived inside a memory not his own. And all day I wandered the halls, trying to find him, to speak, to offer truth in place of myth. But he was gone. Not vanished, just waiting, I sensed, for the right moment. That night, the chimes rang again, and I stood in the main hall instead of hiding in my room, journal in hand, voice ready. Richard, I called softly into the dark. I found your words. And somewhere beyond the staircase, in the breath between the final chimes, a door opened, and the garden, though empty, echoed with the sound of someone coming home. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid, but because for the first time since arriving at Westgrove, I felt like I was holding something fragile and precious in my hands, the truth or some broken approximation of it. And I knew if I let it slip, if I allowed doubt or fatigue to blur its edges, I might never see it clearly again. So I sat by the parlor window as the gray light of morning seeped into the room, reading Richard's journal over and over until the words bled into each other, the ink no longer sentences, but impressions, fingerprints of a man who had spent decades carving his identity into silence. And what became clearest with each entry was that the will Leonard had left me, the one Travers read so carefully, the one with its cryptic midnight warning, was not the original, or at least not the only version that had ever existed. Leonard, methodical as he had been, had kept drafts, each dated, annotated in the margins, and among Richard's notes, I found a reference to the Second Testament, a phrase underlined in thick pencil followed by a scrawled comment. He's hiding the claws. He's changing the story again. The implication sent a cold sweat across my skin. Not because Leonard had concealed something, but because it tried to overwrite it, to revise history in legal ink, and suddenly I understood why it would have felt so incomplete, so performative. The warning wasn't the full truth. It was a compromise. A sanitized directive meant to protect me from what Leonard feared I might find, from what Richard had endured. I searched the house again, this time not for artifacts or photos, but for legal documents, and eventually, in the bottom drawer of Leonard's desk, hidden beneath yellowing blueprints of the estate and receipts from decades past, I found a lockbox, rusted at the hinges but still sealed. It took an hour to pry it open with a fire poker, and inside, beneath layers of tissue-thin parchment, was a folder labeled nullified, its edges singed as if someone had attempted to burn it but hadn't committed. I opened it with care, and there it was, a version of the will dated 6 months before the final copy, signed but never filed, bearing all the expected inheritance clauses. Ownership, responsibility, warnings, but with one crucial addition near the end, typed in bold, a separate section titled Secondary Provision for Occupant of the Estate. I read it twice before it sank in. Should the heir discover any person residing within the confines of Westgrove Estate who has not been legally acknowledged or documented by the Carroll family, they are not to be removed, provoked, or engaged with hostility. They are to be considered a ward of the estate, protected under the same clause as the heir. Midnight is to be honored not as a rule of fear, but of compassion. Some hours cannot be rewritten. My hands trembled. This was not a warning. It was an admission. Leonard had known Richard was still in the house, had built a will to preserve his reality, not hide it. And when confronted with the implications, he had attempted to erase the clause, to prevent anyone, even me, from fully understanding. Not out of malice, but guilt, because Leonard had raised his brother in shadows, shielded him from the world by isolating him within it, allowing his delusion to ossify until it became the only language he spoke. Midnight was not dangerous because of what Richard might do. It was sacred because it was the only time he believed he was not alone. And now, by breaking that rhythm, by stepping into his hour, I had disrupted a fragile balance held together by memory and mercy. I found Richard that afternoon in the West Garden, seated on the bench where he first appeared, his journal open beside him, a blanket draped across his knees, as if he were simply enjoying the breeze. He looked up as I approached, but said nothing, only gestured to the spot beside him. I sat without speaking, unsure how to begin, and after a long moment he asked, "Did you find it?" I nodded. "You knew Leonard changed the will." He smiled, but it was a kind of smile that comes when pain finally becomes too familiar to fight. "He was trying to protect you," he said, "and me," in his own broken way. I handed him the copy I'd found, the version with the clause intact, and he read it slowly, lips moving, eyes wet but unblinking. When he finished, he looked at me, not through me, not at someone else, but at me, truly as if for the first time. "You're not Charles," he said softly. "No," I replied. "I'm his son." He nodded. "Then you've come back for the right reason." We sat there until dusk, the silence between us no longer haunted but shared, and as the shadows lengthened across the garden, I realized that the house hadn't been keeping us apart. It had been waiting for this moment, this reconciliation, however small, however fleeting, to allow both of us a chance to reclaim something true. That night, there were no chimes. Or if they rang, I didn't hear them, because I wasn't in my room. I was in the West Wing, sitting beside Richard in a parlor that smelled of cedar and dust, watching the fireplace glow for the first time in years. And when he spoke, it wasn't a Charles. It was to me. "Tell the story right," he said. "Not the way they wanted it told. Not the way it's written in the walls. The way it really happened." I promised I would. And for the first time since I arrived, the house felt still. Not silent. Not watching. Just at peace. It wasn't until I began researching the Carroll family history in earnest, beyond journals and memories, beyond whispers buried in the floorboards, that I began to truly comprehend the weight of the name I carried, not as an identity, but as a debt inherited across generations. Because while Leonard had tried to bury the truth under codes of silence and rewritten clauses, and Richard had clung to memory as a lifeline in a house that refused to let go, the real horror of Westgrove was Never the midnight clause or the sealed-off wings, but the bloodline itself, the unspoken oath passed down like a virus from father to son, brother to brother, to protect the family at any cost, even if the cost was someone else's reality. And as I unearthed the brittle pages of archived birth records, death notices, and psychiatric reviews, some buried deep in the local council's attic archives, others locked in filing cabinets under pseudonyms, I saw a pattern too precise to dismiss. Generation after generation of Carroll men who disappeared into the house, who went silent after adolescence, whose stories ended not in death but in erasure, like my great-uncle Thomas, institutionalized at 17 for delusional fixations and never spoken of again, or my grandfather's cousin Emery, whose letter stopped abruptly in 1946 with only the vague explanation that he had gone abroad, though no passport record ever confirmed it, and always, in the margins of these documents, the quiet, coded references to Westgrove, as though the house itself was the final destination for those deemed inconvenient, unstable, too strange for polite society. Men and boys hidden not for what they had done, but for what they threatened to reveal. It wasn't madness. It was memory. It was the price of knowing too much. And now that I knew it too, I understood why Leonard had chosen silence over honesty, why Richard had never truly left, and why my father, perhaps the only one who tried to escape, had broken under the weight of the same legacy. I remember standing in the estate's small family chapel, a space I had never entered until that week, and staring at the marble plaques lining the back wall, each engraved with names, each accompanied by a Latin phrase or poetic quote about rest, peace, eternity. But one plaque, older than the others, bore no name at all, only the words he knew too much to leave. I stood there for what felt like hours, fingertips tracing the chiseled stone, wondering which Carroll had earned such a grave and what truth he had uncovered before they took his name. I began to question everything I had been told about inheritance. Not just legal inheritance, but emotional, psychological, moral, and whether any of it had ever truly belonged to me, or if I had simply become the next vessel in a long line of men born to carry silence on their backs. I began to see the estate for what it really was. Not a haunted house, but monument to repression, a grand mausoleum of buried truths where every locked door, every midnight ritual, every forgotten name was part of a ritual designed not to honor the past, but to bury it. Richard, for all his perceived madness, had been the only one brave enough to resist the ritual, to hold on to memory even when it tore him apart. And Leonard, who tried to build order from chaos, had failed not because he was cruel, but because he was terrified. Terrified of what would happen if someone like me ever came back and asked the questions no one else dared. That evening, I stood in the great hall with the original will in one hand and the nullified copy in the other, torn between burning both or framing them side by side as relics of a war fought not with weapons, but with omission, and I realized that the true burden of the Carroll name wasn't madness or shame. It was complicity. Every generation had known, and every generation had chosen silence. Except now. I had a choice, and it wasn't one that could be made lightly. I sat with Richard that night, watching as he dozed in the armchair beneath the old clock, his breath slow and even, and I asked him quietly, "What do you want me to do with all of this?" He didn't open his eyes. He just said, "Don't let them write me out again." I knew then that my responsibility wasn't to restore Westgrove, or preserve it, or even destroy it. It was to remember it truthfully. All of it. The beauty and the rot. The love and the abandonment. The rituals and the betrayals. I began documenting everything. Writing names, dates, locations, threading the Carroll lineage like a crime scene investigator trying to reconstruct a forgotten atrocity. And with each connection I drew, the clearer the picture became. A family that had tried to hide its wounds by cutting away anything that bled. But now the bleeding had reached me, and I had to decide whether to cauterize or expose. The burden was no longer abstract. It had a face. It had a name. And it lived in the west wing of the estate, waiting for someone to finally say it aloud. The decision to stay awake past midnight, to cross the invisible line drawn generations before me, wasn't an act of defiance. It was an act of necessity, a final step in a journey that had slowly stripped away every illusion I'd ever carried about my family, this estate, and myself, because by now I understood that the hour wasn't cursed, wasn't sacred. It was constructed, a boundary designed not to protect anyone but to maintain the fragile delusion that silence was safety, and that if no one asked the right questions after dark, then maybe the truth would remain buried undisturbed like bones beneath polished marble. But silence is not the same as peace, and when I stood at the threshold of the West Wing just before the chimes began to toll, I knew there would be no returning to the version of myself that arrived here believing in ghosts, but not in generational accountability. And so, with Richard asleep beside the fireplace, unaware or perhaps unwilling to stop me, I stepped into the hallway and walked its length with purpose, past the portraits of forgotten Caros, past the doors that had remained locked out of fear rather than respect, until I reached the room at the end, the one Leonard had sealed not with locks, but with words, the one no map included, the one I had dreamt about more times than I cared to admit, and as the 12th chime echoed through the beams and bones of Westgrove, I turned the brass handle and entered the room that time had tried to erase. Inside was not horror, not madness, not some grotesque monument to trauma. Inside was a study, a simple, immaculate study. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with ledgers, diaries, tapes, and photographs, all meticulously organized, all labeled by date and subject. In the center of the room, beneath a soft yellow light, sat a desk covered in maps of the estate, annotated with red ink. And on the desk, facing the doorway, sat a single open journal, the final page marked with Leonard's unmistakable handwriting. If he's reading this, it means I failed, or succeeded. I can't be sure anymore. My knees buckled, and I sat in the chair across from the desk, tears stinging my eyes, because even now, even in death, Leonard was trying to reach me, trying to speak to the clutter of years in silence. The journal entry continued. He doesn't know what we did, how we chose to forget, how we let the truth rot beneath the floorboards because it was easier to pretend we were cursed than to admit we were complicit. He deserves better than this house, but I don't know how to give it to him. And below that, scribbled in haste, was a name I had never seen in any family record. Eliza Caro, 1933 to 1955. Ask Richard. I closed the journal and began pulling volumes from the shelves, searching for Eliza, for anything that would explain her sudden intrusion into this blood-soaked narrative, and what I found was worse than any ghost story. Eliza was Richard's twin, my father's younger sister, a child erased not by accident or tragedy, but by design. Her record stopped in 1955, the year she turned 22, the same year the chapel added a plaque without a name. I found one letter, folded into a medical file, written in Eliza's own hand to someone unnamed. They think locking her away will fix it, that if she stops writing, the voices will stop. But they're not voices. They're memories. Memories that aren't mine but demand to be remembered. My breath caught. The voices, the delusions weren't madness. They were inheritance. Like mine, like Richard's. I rushed back to the parlor, where Richard still sat, barely awake, his eyes glassy. I knelt beside him and whispered, "Who was Eliza?" For a moment, I thought he hadn't heard me. Then he said, voice thin as smoke, she remembered too much. They said it was killing her, so they buried her inside us. I didn't ask what he meant. I understood. They had silenced her by rewriting her into their pain. She became the unnamed grief passed down like rumor, like fear. And now I knew why midnight mattered. It wasn't a threshold between the living and the dead. It was a border between what was said and what was left unsaid, between stories told and stories buried. I returned to the sealed study and took every book, every photograph, every tape I could carry. I brought them to the main hall and placed them beneath the grandfather clock. And as the chimes rang again, I struck a match, not to destroy the evidence, but to release it. Fire, unlike silence, tells no lies. It reveals. It consumes. It purifies. Flames lick the edges of forgotten memories, curling old truths into smoke. And in that moment, I felt the house shift, not collapse, not groan, but exhale, as if Westgrove itself was grateful. Richard joined me by the doorway, his expression unreadable, and when I looked at him, truly looked, I saw not a madman, not a relic, but a survivor. "It's over," I said, and he replied, "No, it's begun." He was right. The hour was broken. The loop was shattered. The silence was gone, and in its place stood something terrifying and beautiful. Freedom. I end the days that followed the burning of the study. The house grew quieter, not in the oppressive, suffocating way it had once held its breath, but in the way a long-suffering body does after a fever breaks, trembling in relief yet still weakened by all it endured. And as I walked its corridors with ash still clinging to the soles of my shoes and smoke lodged deep in my throat, I began to understand the difference between silence imposed and silence earned, because for the first time, Westgrove was not holding anything back. It was simply empty, emptied of secrets, of ritual, of that thick, sour tension that had defined its very shape. And though I had expected some grand catharsis, some dramatic collapse of ceilings, or a sudden awakening of buried ghosts, what came instead was something far more subtle and far more cruel: clarity. The kind of clarity that arrives not as revelation, but as consequence. The truth was out, the records destroyed, the story spoken. But the damage done by generations of silence still echoed through every doorframe, every floorboard, and as I began packing to leave, collecting the few items that hadn't been soaked in fire or memory, I realized that my inheritance wasn't this house. Not really. It was a space left behind by everything it had tried to hide. I stood in the chapel one last time, staring up at the unnamed plaque, and I whispered the name Eliza Carroll again and again until the sound of it no longer felt like breaking something, but like building something new. I wanted to believe that was enough, that speaking her name could undo the decades of forgetting, that bringing Richard into the daylight, letting him walk the grounds with no more curfews, no more locked wings, no more whispered names, was an act of redemption. But I also knew better. Some inheritances are not cleansed. They are carried. Richard did not follow me when I left. He chose to remain, tending the garden with a devotion that broke my heart, clipping dead ivy from the statues, replanting flowers in the overgrown beds, as though by nurturing the land, he could somehow rewrite the house's legacy without words. I left him the deed, the keys, the freedom to be who he was, not who the house told him to be. And I promised before I left that I would tell the story, not the myth of a haunted estate, not the sanitized obituary of Leonard Carroll or the redacted reports of Richard's instability, but the truth, that silence left too long becomes violence, that families, when frightened of their own truths, become their own executioners. I returned to the city with nothing but a notebook and the journal Leonard left behind, and I wrote every day, pages filled with names, with years, with questions that still lingered, but I didn't publish, not at first, because I was afraid. Afraid of turning pain into spectacle. Afraid of becoming the next Carroll to rewrite history for comfort. But eventually I did. I told the story in fragments, in essays, in interviews, always careful, always honest. And the more I shared, the more I found others who had inherited similar silences, whose families had built their legacies on things they dared not name. And in that chorus of recognition, I felt less alone. But Westgrove never quite let go. Even now, years later, I dream of it. The way the light hit the dust and conservatory at dusk, the sound of Richard humming to himself in the hallway, the crackle of flames consuming lies too old to carry. And I wonder if the house still stands, or if it, too, has collapsed under the weight of its own long memory. I never went back, not because I feared what I'd find, but because I knew there was nothing left for me to inherit. I had taken what I needed, not the walls, or the land, or the name, but the silence, and I did not pass it on. Years have passed since I last set foot on the gravel path leading to Westgrove, and though I once believed distance and time would be enough to dull the pull exerted on me, I've come to learn that some places do not remain behind us. They move with us, silent passengers nestled deep within the folds of our decisions, and Westgrove, in all its fractured memory and reluctant honesty, has never truly left me. I see it in brief flashes, the curve of an old staircase in A, museum, the smell of damp cedar in a friend's hallway, a garden bench dappled in shade just so. And when these moments arrive, they do not frighten me as they once might have. They merely remind me of what remains when everything else is gone, because what I inherited was not a house or a name or even a past, but a lesson, and that lesson has colored every part of my life since. That silence, no matter how noble its disguise, is never innocent. That unspoken truths fester in the quiet until they begin to shape us in their image, And what Westgrove had become was not haunted by spirits, but by decisions, by the long echo of choices made in the dark and justified in the light. And though I dismantled its ritual and scattered its truths like ashes, the weight of that history lives on not as a curse, but as a caution, and I find myself guarding against it daily, in how I speak to those I love, in how I confront discomfort instead of burying it, in how I teach my children that family is not an altar to be worshipped, but a bond that must be constantly tended, questioned, and earned. I did return once, not to stay, not to reclaim anything, but to see it one final time, and what I found surprised me more than I'd expected. Westgrove was still standing, but it was no longer brooding. The grounds had been cleared, the windows cleaned, the roof restored in places, and the ivy cut back to reveal stone I hadn't seen since my arrival, clean gray, worn smooth by weather and effort, and standing at the threshold was Richard, older now, slower, but undeniably grounded, a man who had carved a place for himself in the very walls that once confined him. And when he saw me, he didn't smile, but he nodded, the kind of nod that says everything words cannot, and I understood then that he had made peace not with what had been done to him, but with who he had become despite it. We didn't speak much. There was no need. He walked me through the halls once more, his halls now, pointing out repairs he'd made, books he'd reorganized, gardens he'd replanted, and it struck me with sudden, aching clarity that the house had finally become what it should have been all along, a home, not for performing a legacy, but for the quiet dignity of truth. As I left, he handed me a small box. Inside was a photograph, one I had never seen. It showed a young Eliza standing between two boys who looked like mirror images of youth, my father and Richard, all three smiling, real smiles, untainted by history. On the back, written in a looping, uncertain hand, were the words, "We remembered her." I keep that photo on my desk now, next to the final page of Leonard's journal and a small stone from the garden bench where it all began. And when people ask me what Westgrove was, what it meant,